Chapter 14. We flagged down a car that was heading into town, and Grandpa asked if he could borrow their phone so we could call Grandma to give us a ride. She showed up 10 minutes later with a cardboard box and a blanket to wrap up the newborn deer and keep her warm inside a makeshift bed. Grandpa let me carry the box to the car. I was surprised at how light the little animal was. It couldn't have been more than 5 or 6 pounds, about the size of a tiny human newborn. I walked slowly and carefully, then gently placed the baby box in the back seat before settling in beside it. Grandma drove me and the calf into town, while Grandpa followed behind with Big Bear on the cycle. Grandpa dropped Bear off at home, then disappeared while Grandma and I got the fawn settled into a corner of the shed. Grandma dragged a few more blankets out of the basement to cover the hard, dirty floor, and I cleared away anything that looked sharp or at risk of falling on the little fawn in the night. When Grandpa Howard returned from wherever he'd gone, he found me tucked into a corner of the shed, with my legs curled around the deer to help keep it warm. He was holding a baby bottle in one hand and a big bag full of hay in the other. He looked at me and the calf for a moment, then held the bottle toward me and said, "You need to get her to drink this special formula." "Me?" "Looks like she trusts you," he said, squatting down beside me. He started shaking hay out onto the floor of the shed, creating a fresh, soft bed for the calf to lie on. I talked to my friend over at the Department of Natural Resources to see what we got to do to help this critter out now that her mama's gone. We have to get this special stuff in her body as soon as possible. It's similar to the milk she would have gotten from her mother within the first hour or so after she was born, and it's filled with all kinds of nutrients and vitamins that will help keep her from getting sick. If she survives the night, then tomorrow we'll start her on goat's milk or a deer milk alternative. But tonight is going to be critical to keeping her alive. I gazed down at the tiny critter, now settled into a tight circle surrounded by hay and blankets. Her soft brown coat with the milky white spots, the little rib bones you could see outlined through her velvety hide, curled up in the shed, unaware that she'd been left all alone to make her way in the world. This creature was relying on me to keep her alive through her first night, and there was absolutely no way I was going to let someone die on my watch. I grabbed the bottle from Grandpa and nudged it against the little fawn's mouth. She moved her lips around but seemed confused about what was happening. Grandpa helped me adjust how I held the bottle, and together we kept trying to get her to drink. The calf wanted nothing except to sleep. The poor little thing, safe and sound and snugly inside her mother's belly 1 minute, pulled out into the world by a pair of human hands the next. I shook the bottle, easing a little of the fluid out of the nipple until it dripped onto her face. Grandpa reached forward, touching the calf, and did something that made the fawn's mouth open just the tiniest bit. As soon as it was open, I sprinkled a few drops of the liquid onto her tongue. She squirmed, her mouth moving awkwardly as she tried to swallow it down. After a few more drops like this, she reached out and put her mouth to the bottle's nipple. She picked and prodded at it at first, but then she took it in her mouth and slowly began to nurse. She only swallowed a few tiny drops, but Grandpa said it was a good first effort. "Just like you up at the fire tower," he said. "We got to start slow. Ease her into it. This is all new to her." According to Grandpa's friend at the DNR, who I guess knew about these sorts of things, we were supposed to feed her every 4 hours for the first few days, but he promised it would get easier once she got the hang of the bottle and started to actually feel hungrier without us telling her it was time to drink. That night, Grandma and Grandpa let me carry a sleeping bag out to the shed and sleep beside the fawn. Bear sat right outside the door of the shed, instinctively protecting both me and the baby deer from any would-be intruders. Grandma brought me a sandwich and a bowl of ice cream and took over watch duties while I ran inside to brush my teeth and use the bathroom. As soon as I returned to the shed, I snuggled into my sleeping bag, nestled in right beside the fawn's pile of hay and blankets, and studied the sleepy baby in the hazy evening light, making sure she didn't look sick, sad, or in any discomfort. The little fawn just looked asleep. Luckily, I could see her ribs moving a fraction of an inch every few seconds, so I knew she wasn't dead or anything. I was worried that's what would happen next, that she would just up and die, and suddenly I'd be lying there next to a dead animal. I wasn't sure, based on what Grandpa had said. how likely it was that she'd survive the night. She seemed to be doing all right to me, but I knew literally nothing about baby deer. I lay there in the dark, musty shed, reaching out to touch the deer's flank every 5 minutes or so. I could hear Grandpa going in and out of his camper door in the yard, but eventually things quieted outside. Bear began to snore and snuffle in his sleep, which was how I knew he hadn't left his post. I could hear an owl hooting, low, somber, mournful, somewhere out in the woods behind the house. But otherwise, the world was still, and I let myself relax and think about what I'd done that afternoon. I had climbed part way up a fire tower and helped my grandpa birth a baby deer. How many kids from my school at home in Chicago could say that? I think it was safe to guess a grand total of none. My sister would love this story, and I could already predict she'd make me tell it over and over again, until every last detail was set to memory, making it impossible for me to forget this day as long as I lived. Eventually I fell asleep. Several times in the night I woke to the sound of movement. Once I looked over and saw the fawn shifting inside her haystack. I sat up worried. For the 100th time I touched the side of her bony body to be sure she was still breathing. She was. I picked up the bottle and offered her a drink. She played with the nipple and took it gingerly into her mouth, drinking a little of the special formula down. After she tired of the effort of drinking from the human baby bottle, she let out a soft breath and settled into sleep again. Later in the night, I heard something at the door. I peeked through half-closed eyes and caught Grandpa sneaking in to check on us. He'd come with a fresh bottle, and while I pretended to sleep, he crouched down beside the two of us and offered the fawn more food. In the light of the moon, which snuck in through the half-open shed door, I saw a look on his face that was impossible not to understand. A mix of love, compassion, and concern. In that moment, I decided Grandpa Howard was magnificent. No one could look at a newborn fawn that way and not be something special. I fell asleep to the sound of Grandpa clucking and cooing at the deer, urging her to take just a few more sips. By some miracle, the fawn made it through the night. I woke to find her mewling beside me. Grandpa arrived almost instantly, passing me yet another bottle. I pressed it toward the deer's mouth, and this time she took it immediately. She gummed at the nipple, then began to suck. She pulled away a few times, overwhelmed by the heavy flow of milk from the man-made bottle, but she had obviously already gotten the hang of it. She drank eagerly, filling her empty belly with food and nutrients. I was relieved that she was eating, but sad that she'd never met her mother or the rest of her family. In one split second, her whole life had shifted course. Was it better, I wondered, to never know how things would have been if life had played out differently? Was it easier not to have to mourn the things you never knew you'd lost? That morning, Grandpa stuck around the house longer than usual. Grandma got someone to cover her shift at work so that I didn't have to go out to the fire tower and could keep the fawn's feeding schedule somewhat regular. Grandpa left around 9, but told me he'd set up a few visits throughout the day from friends he knew from his Forest Service days. They had offered to swing by and give us some tips and advice on raising the calf. He'd also called some lady he knew, a vet with wildlife experience, and asked her to stop by to give the calf a quick once-over. Apparently, the Forest Service people had suggested that we send the fawn to a wildlife rehabilitation center, but Grandpa had adamantly refused. I've got some experience with this sort of thing, and she's going to get plenty of personal attention and care here, he grumbled while we were working together to set up a little fenced area just out the door of the shed. The fawn would apparently spend most of her first few weeks sleeping and lying around, but we wanted her to have a safe place to roam when she did decide to get up and stretch her legs. We're her family now, and a family's job is to take care of each other when bad stuff happens. I was thankful Grandpa had decided not to send the calf away. I'd gotten attached and felt responsible for her well-being. Bear had already proven he was a charming gentleman by keeping his distance and protecting our little guest, so the new kid was fitting in well. Around lunchtime, after her second feeding of the day and several visits from Forest Service folks and the friendly vet, The fawn decided to test out her legs and walk around a little for the first time since we pulled her from her mother's womb. She stumbled a bit as she got to her feet, but then she took a few shaky steps across the shed. She ambled out into the tiny yard we'd set up for her and took in her surroundings. After less than a minute, her legs gave out again and she plopped down on the soft grass. I sat crisscross applesauce and studied her, watching the way she breathed, listening to the sweet little mewling sounds she made, admiring her knobby limbs that seemed too long for her tiny body. The sun beat down on the grass, warming us both. After a moment, her eyes drifted closed and she settled into a relaxed sleep. Bear came over to sniff her over the short fencing. He gently pressed his nose against her body, verifying that she was all right, and then lay down, right beside her, on the other side of the fence. Grandma came outside every once in a while to deliver an apple or some cheese and crackers. At one point, she carried a tray with Kool-Aid for me, a dish of fresh water for Bear, and a fresh bottle for the calf. The three of us were still there, relaxing in and around the fenced deer pen a few hours later when Griffin got off the school bus. He bounded down the lane, whooping and hollering a greeting to me and Bear. Unlike most days, Bear didn't run to greet him. It was obvious that he wasn't willing to leave his new sister unprotected. I waved Griffin over, watching his expression shift when he noticed the tiny newborn critter curled up in the corner of the pen. "What is that?" he gasped. I told him the story of what had happened, and Griffin listened intently. Then he whispered, "Can I touch it?" "Sure," I said. If there were any chance her mother was still alive, we wouldn't want to touch her, so as not to alter her scent or get in the way of her mother feeding and raising her properly, I explained. But since her mom is dead, and we're the best hope she has for survival, all the usual rules for handling wildlife are off. Griffin climbed over the fence, settling down on his knees to touch the fawn's velvety ear. Bear whined, begging to come inside the pen with us. But Grandpa and I had already decided it was best if we kept the two of them apart, until we knew the calf was thriving. Griffin looked at me curiously. "Since when are you an expert in raising deer?" I laughed. "A vet and some people from the Forest Service and the DNR came by today to look her over. Until then, I knew nothing." Griffin ran his fingers gently over her rib cage. "She's so tiny," he said reverently. "What's her name?" "I haven't named her yet," I told him. "I was waiting for you." "For me?" Griffin looked like I'd just awarded him with a pot of gold, not naming rights to an orphan deer. "Are you serious?" "You gave Big Bear the perfect name," I told him. "What do you think fits her?" Griffin's face shifted into his thinking expression. "Well," he said, his eyes shifting upward to look at the sky, "I'm thinking Wilma." I snorted out a laugh. "Wilma? Like Wilbur from Charlotte's Web, but a girl. Wilma." "Wilma," I repeated, testing it out. "It's perfect." Griffin bent down and cooed into the fawn's ear. "Hello, Wilma. Welcome to Thistledew."